He promised to go slow on her first time, but her charm made him lose all control. Nobody imagined that night would change everything between them forever. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and hit like because what happened next will leave you breathless. The Bohemian crystal tumbler slipped from Emma's trembling hands, shattering against the Italian marble floor of the penthouse in Upper East Side Manhattan, while James's cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine, enveloped her completely. She had never imagined that the simple act of being in a man's arms could make her heart race like this, as if she'd run miles under the scorching midday sun of summer in Central Park. The sound of crystal breaking echoed in the silence of the terrace, where the lights of New York City flickered like fallen fireflies across the horizon. James held her with a firmness that contrasted with the delicacy of his fingers on her face, tracing invisible lines from her temples to her jaw. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the world spin too fast, too intense for her 21 years of existence, protected among books and silence. "Don't be afraid," he whispered against her forehead, his deep voice vibrating in the minimal space that separated them. But Emma was afraid of the unknown, afraid of the intensity she felt, afraid that her inexperienced hands wouldn't know how to respond to the experienced touch of a man who had lived 2 decades longer than she had. Her fingers clutched at James's white linen shirt, wrinkling the impeccable fabric, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a moment where everything seemed liquid and unstable. The October wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain, mixing with the perfume of gardenias growing in terracotta pots along the balustrade. The city stretched below them like a sea of lights and promises, but Emma could only focus on James's breathing, on the heat emanating from his body, on the way his lips brushed her hair, with a reverence that made her feel simultaneously fragile and powerful. There was an inescapable truth whispering in the New York air of that terrace. Some promises are destined to break like crystal, and in their sharp fragments lies the possibility of transformation. 3 months earlier, Emma was organizing volumes in the American poetry section of the New York Public Library when their hands collided, reaching for the same book, a rare edition of Robert Frost's verses, with the cover worn from decades of passionate readings. The accidental contact sent an electric current up her arm, making her recoil so abruptly she nearly dropped the stack of books she held against her chest. "Sorry," she murmured automatically, lowering her gaze as she always did, studying the pattern of the wooden floor she knew by heart. "No, I'm sorry," responded a masculine voice, deep and careful, with a distinct New York accent that softened the consonants. Emma forced herself to look up and found a man who seemed out of place in the academic and worn environment of the library. His charcoal grey suit was clearly custom-made, probably from some Fifth Avenue tailor, and the watch peeking from under his cuff must have cost more than all the furniture in the section. But what really unsettled her were his eyes, honey-colored, almost amber, watching her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen for the first time in her life. "The book is yours," she hurried to say, extending the volume toward him with slightly trembling hands. "I was just reorganizing this section." James took the book, but his fingers brushed hers in the exchange, a contact that lasted a second longer than necessary. Emma felt the heat rise up her neck, tinting her cheeks a telltale pink she hated not being able to control. "Do you work here?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from her modest navy dress and the ID badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. "Yes, I'm a cataloging assistant," Emma responded, her voice barely above a whisper in the reverent silence of the library. "Can I help you find something else?" For the next 20 minutes, she guided him through narrow corridors, explaining the classification system with enthusiasm she normally reserved only for books. James listened with attention that seemed genuine, asking intelligent questions about chronological versus thematic organization, about preserving ancient manuscripts, about the challenges of digitizing historical collections. Emma was surprised to find herself talking more than she had talked to anyone in months. There was something about the way he listened, leaning slightly toward her, maintaining eye contact without it being intimidating, that made her feel her words had value, that her knowledge mattered. When they finally said goodbye at the circulation desk, Emma realized she hadn't even asked his name. She watched his back as he walked away, the way his shoulders filled the suit with a confidence she could never possess, and felt a strange pang in her chest. Something between melancholy and curiosity, between wanting him to return and fearing that he would. That night, lying in her small apartment in Brooklyn, where traffic noise filtered through poorly insulated windows, Emma couldn't stop thinking about those honey-colored eyes and how her heart had beaten differently when he smiled. James returned the next day, and the next, and the one after that. Always with a different excuse, always with that smile that slightly crinkled the corners of his eyes, always leaving a generous contribution in the donations box that Emma knew the library desperately needed. He was looking for books about colonial American architecture, needed references about the Civil War era, wanted to better understand the evolution of modernist literature. Emma knew in some conscious corner of her mind that a successful businessman didn't need to visit a public library every day. He had the resources to buy any book, access to private databases, limited time that was certainly worth more than he spent on these visits. But she chose to believe the excuses because the alternative was too disturbing, too improbable for someone like her. On the third day, he arrived when she was on a ladder, reaching for a volume on the top shelf. Emma felt his presence before seeing him, a physical awareness that made her momentarily lose her balance. Her hands gripped the edge of the shelf, and before she could fall, she felt James's hands on her waist, firm and warm through the thin fabric of her dress. "Careful," he said, his voice closer than she expected. Emma climbed down from the ladder awkwardly, too aware that he hadn't removed his hands immediately, that his fingers remained light against her sides a moment beyond strictly necessary. When he finally released her, she felt the cold of his absence like a physical loss. "Thank you," she murmured, hugging the book against her chest like a shield. "Have you had lunch today?" James asked suddenly, a question that caught her completely off guard. Emma blinked, processing the words as if they were in a foreign language. "I usually eat here in the storage room. I have a sandwich." "Come with me," he said, and it wasn't exactly a command, but not a simple invitation either. "There's a deli on the corner, 15 minutes. I just need to talk to someone who understands why books matter more than spreadsheets." It was the vulnerability in those last words that made Emma nod, the sense that behind the expensive suits and apparent confidence, there was loneliness. She recognized that loneliness because it lived in her own chest, a constant companion she had learned to ignore between others' pages. The deli was small and cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the aroma of fresh coffee, mixing with that of pastrami sandwiches fresh from the oven. James ordered for both without consulting the menu, and Emma was surprised that his choices were exactly what she would have ordered if she'd had the courage. "My name is James," he said finally, extending his hand across the small table. "James Hartwell." "Emma," she responded, her hand disappearing into his. "Emma Collins." The handshake was firm but brief, professional. And yet, Emma felt that something had been sealed in that contact, some tacit agreement she couldn't name but felt with unsettling certainty. For the next hour they talked, or rather, Emma talked more than she had in years, about her love for ancient manuscripts, about how the smell of old paper was the most beautiful perfume in the world, about her dream of someday writing about the forgotten women in American historical chronicles. James listened with attention that made her words seem important, valuable. When they returned to the library, the afternoon had advanced, and shadows lengthened on the cobblestone streets of the neighborhood. James said goodbye with a promise to return, and Emma spent the rest of her shift in a state of emotional confusion that oscillated between euphoria and panic. That night she looked up his name online. James Hartwell, New York businessman, 40 years old, founder and CEO of Hartwell Capital, estimated net worth. Emma closed the laptop abruptly, her heart beating painfully. It was a world completely different from hers, a universe of yachts and charity galas and photographs in society magazines. A universe where a 21-year-old librarian without an important surname had no place. The storm arrived without warning on a November afternoon, darkening New York's sky within minutes. Emma was closing the library, following her routine of checking that all windows were locked and lights turned off, when she realized she wasn't alone. James remained in the history section, apparently absorbed in a book he was holding, but not reading. "The library is closed," Emma said softly, approaching down the corridor. "You'll have to—" A thunderclap rumbled so loudly the windows vibrated, cutting off her words. Rain began hammering the roof with violence that made it impossible to hear anything else. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the library into darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. Emma stifled a gasp, her hand instinctively seeking the edge of the nearest shelf to orient herself. She felt, rather than saw, James move toward her, his presence solid in the disorienting darkness. "I'm here," he said, his voice calm but close. "Don't be afraid. The emergency lights should—" Emma began, but her voice trembled slightly. As if in response, the emergency lights came on, bathing the library in a greenish, ghostly glow that transformed the familiar corridors into something strange and dreamlike. Emma could finally see James, standing less than a meter away, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "I can't leave in this storm," he said, and something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about the weather. "Do you have any objection to me staying here until it passes?" Emma shook her head, unable to trust her voice. Together they settled on the floor of the library's storage room, where she kept a thermos of coffee and some cookies for long afternoons. The rain drummed against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, and occasionally a thunderclap shook the old building's structure. "Why do you come here every day?" Emma asked suddenly, the words escaping before she could censor them. The truth, the silence that followed, was long, filled only by the sound of the storm. James drank his coffee slowly, as if deciding how much truth to share. "Because here I can breathe," he said finally. "Because when I talk to you, I don't feel like I have to be James Hartwell, the businessman. I can just be James." "I don't understand," Emma whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. "You could be anywhere, with anyone. Why would you waste your time with a librarian who knows nothing about the real world?" James turned to her so abruptly that Emma startled. There was something fierce in his honey-colored eyes, something that made her hold her breath. "Wasting my time," he repeated, his voice low but intense. "Emma, you're the only real thing I've found in years. You don't look at me and see dollar signs. You listen when I talk about things that matter, things that have nothing to do with profit margins or market share. Do you know how much that's worth?" Tears began sliding down Emma's cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever chosen her before. No one had seen her as anything more than the quiet girl who organized books. No one had crossed the city, invented excuses, waited patiently just to spend time in her company. "I'm 21 years old," she whispered, as if that explained everything. "I don't know. I haven't. Never. I know," James said softly, reaching for her hand carefully, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. "And I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking permission to get to know you, to spend time with you without pretexts, to show you there's a world out there that can be yours too." Emma's fingers intertwined with his almost of their own accord. His hand was warm and secure, and the simple act of holding it felt simultaneously innocent and transformative. They had crossed an invisible line in that dark storage room, under the sound of the storm battering New York as if trying to wash away all the city's sins. "I'm scared," Emma confessed, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Me too," James admitted, gently squeezing her hand. "But maybe we can be scared together." When the storm finally subsided 2 hours later, Emma knew something fundamental had changed. She could no longer pretend James was just another library visitor. She could no longer pretend her heart didn't leap every time she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She could no longer deny she had begun imagining a future that included those honey-colored eyes looking at her, as if she were something precious. As they closed the library together under a sky beginning to clear, revealing shy stars among dispersing clouds, James asked if she would allow him to take her to dinner the following Saturday. Not to a casual deli, but a real restaurant, a real date. Emma said yes, though the word came out trembling and uncertain. And as she walked back to her apartment, allowing herself for the first time to imagine what it would be like to kiss him, she didn't notice the first dead autumn leaves swirling at her feet, presaging changes she couldn't yet anticipate. The black dress James had sent to her apartment that morning hung from the closet like a silent accusation. It was beautiful, undeniably elegant, made of fabric so soft Emma was afraid to touch it too much. The note that accompanied it was simple: "For someone who deserves to feel beautiful, not an obligation, just a possibility. J." Emma looked at herself in the stained mirror of her small bathroom, seeing the 21-year-old girl with damp hair after her shower and eyes wide with anxiety. The dress remained hanging untouched. Part of her wanted to wear it, wanted to know what it would be like to transform into someone who could belong to James's world. Another part feared that once she did, she could never go back to being simply Emma, the librarian content with her modest life. In the end, she wore it. The fabric slid over her skin like dark water, adjusting to a body she'd never paid much attention to. When she looked in the mirror again, she almost didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back looked older, more sophisticated, almost beautiful, in a way that took her breath away. James arrived exactly at 8, driving himself in a car Emma couldn't identify, but that clearly cost more than everything she owned. The expression on his face when he saw her in the dress made every second of insecurity worthwhile. "You look," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. Words aren't enough. The restaurant was everything Emma had imagined, and nothing she was prepared for. Per se, a legendary establishment where politicians and celebrities shared tables with businessmen and heirs. The maitre d' greeted James by name, guiding them to a table in a private corner where candlelight transformed everything into golden tones and soft shadows. Emma studied the menu with growing panic. There were no prices, which probably meant they were high enough not to be mentioned. She recognized the names of dishes from cookbooks she'd read, but had never tasted anything more elaborate than homemade pot roast. "Relax," James said softly, closing his own menu. "It's just food. If you don't like something, we'll change it. No pressure, no expectations." But there were expectations in the restaurant's air, in the curious glances of other diners, in the way the staff treated them with reverent deference. Emma could feel the weight of eyes assessing her, wondering who this unknown girl was dining with James Hartwell. The conversation started hesitant, forced by the artificiality of the environment. But gradually, as wine softened the sharp edges of her anxiety, Emma found herself relaxing. James had the gift of making her forget where they were, of creating a bubble of intimacy even in the middle of that public and ostentatious place. He told her about his childhood in Brooklyn, about how he'd built his first company with borrowed money and youthful arrogance, about sleepless nights and risks that now seemed reckless, but then felt like his only option. There was pain in his words, scars from rejections and failures he had turned into fuel for his relentless ambition. "What about your family?" Emma asked, pushing the seared scallops she couldn't eat around her plate. "What do they think about all this?" James's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "My mother died 5 years ago," he said without emotion, "and as for the rest, let's just say family expectations and my personal choices rarely coincide." Emma didn't press, recognizing the unnamed pain lurking behind those carefully neutral words. Instead, she began talking about her own past, about a lonely childhood, with a single mother who worked double shifts to support them, about how books had become her family and her escape. "That's why the library is so important to me," she explained, her eyes shining with passion. "It's not just a job. That's the only place where I've always felt at home, where everything makes sense." It was when leaving the restaurant that the first fragment of James's reality penetrated the bubble they'd built. A photographer appeared from nowhere, his camera firing bursts of blinding light. James instinctively protected her with his body, his hand firm at the small of her back as he quickly guided her to the car. "Who is she, James?" the photographer shouted. "The new girlfriend?" "What happened to Victoria?" The name echoed in the silence of the car as they drove away. Victoria. Emma didn't ask, but the name floated between them like an uninvited ghost. James drove with a tense jaw, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry," he said finally when they stopped in front of Emma's building. "I shouldn't have exposed you to that." "Who is Victoria?" Emma asked, surprising herself with her bravery. James closed his eyes briefly, his head resting against the seat back. "Someone from my past. Someone my family approved of because she came from the right world, said the right things, fit perfectly in all the photographs. Someone who never made me feel what I feel when I'm with you." "And what do you feel when you're with me?" Emma whispered. James turned to her, and in the dimness of the car, his eyes seemed darker, more intense. "Hope," he said simply. "Something I hadn't felt in a long time." He didn't kiss her that night, though Emma could see the desire in his eyes, could feel the tension in the narrow space between them. Instead, he took her hand and kissed it with old-fashioned reverence, his lips warm against her cold fingers. "Good night, Emma," he murmured against her skin. "Thank you for trusting me tonight." Emma climbed the stairs to her apartment on trembling legs, the ghost of his touch burning on her hand. She carefully changed out of the dress, hanging it as if it were something sacred, and lay in her narrow bed staring at the cracked ceiling. She could hear the familiar sounds of her building, the upstairs neighbor's television, a baby crying 3 doors down, the constant New York traffic that never completely slept. But in her mind, she remained in that car, feeling James's lips against her skin, hearing that word, hope. And she wondered, as sleep finally claimed her, if she was strong enough to be someone's hope when she could barely stand on her own. The following weeks were a whirlwind of firsts. The first trip outside New York to Cape Cod, where waves crashed against rocks with force that seemed to echo the turbulence in her chest. The first time sleeping in a bed that wasn't hers, in a hotel room so luxurious she felt like an imposter. The first time tasting lobster rolls and discovering she loved them, surprising herself. James was patient in ways Emma hadn't anticipated. He never pushed beyond kisses that left her breathless and yearning for something more she didn't know how to name. His hands explored only where she allowed, retreating at the first sign of hesitation. It was a dance of advances and retreats, of mutual discovery that was both terrifying and thrilling. But the reality of who James was began seeping in ways they couldn't ignore. The photographs from the restaurant had appeared on gossip blogs, speculating about the identity of the mysterious young woman in the company of New York's most eligible bachelor businessman. Online comments ranged from curious to cruel, questioning her age, her modest appearance, her evident lack of sophistication. Emma tried to ignore them, but the words lodged like splinters under her skin. Gold digger? A child? Clearly not his class. Each comment was a confirmation of her own fears, of the inner voice that whispered she was out of her depth, playing a game whose rules she'd never learn. The breaking point came in the form of a formal invitation to dinner with James's family. His mother, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, had expressed her desire to meet her son's new companion. The word wasn't girlfriend, Emma noted, just companion, as if she were temporary and interchangeable. She prepared wearing the black dress James had given her, though now it reminded her of that first night of exposure, the evaluating looks, the feeling of being exhibited like something curious. James picked her up looking tense, his usual confidence replaced by rigidity that spoke of his own family demons. Mrs. Hartwell's house on the Upper East Side was exactly what Emma had feared. A spectacle of generational wealth, of carefully curated art and antique furniture that probably cost more than everything her mother had earned in her life. The matriarch waited in a formal sitting room, dressed in pearls and barely veiled disapproval. "So you're Emma," Mrs. Hartwell said, without rising from her emerald green velvet armchair. "James has told me something about you." The dinner was a masterclass in subtle humiliation. Each question was a trap designed to expose the differences between them. Which university had Emma attended? None yet. What languages did she speak? Only English and basic Spanish. What did she think about recent stock market fluctuations? She had no idea. James's sister, Caroline, watched with an amused smile, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The sound of silverware against porcelain was deafening in the tense silences. Emma barely touched her food, her stomach closed in a knot of anxiety. She could feel James beside her, his frustration palpable in the tension of his shoulders, but he didn't intervene. And that lack of defense hurt more than all his mother's insinuations. It was when Mrs. Hartwell mentioned Victoria that something in Emma finally broke. Victoria understood the responsibilities that come with this surname, the matriarch said, delicately dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. She knew how to behave at important events, how to maintain conversations with business partners, how to properly represent the family. "Mother," James's voice was a low warning. "I'm just saying," Mrs. Hartwell continued relentlessly, "that there are expectations in our social position. A partner must be capable of fulfilling certain roles, maintaining certain appearances." Her eyes landed on Emma with calculated coldness. "She must be appropriate." Emma felt tears burn behind her eyes and forced herself to swallow them. She wouldn't give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she excused herself politely, murmuring something about the restroom, and escaped to the marble hallway where she could finally breathe. She looked at herself in the powder room mirror, so elaborately decorated it looked like a museum. The girl staring back looked small, out of place, costumed in clothes that didn't belong to her, playing a role for which she was never trained. For the first time since meeting James, Emma wondered if his mother was right, if perhaps she was too young, too inexperienced, too ordinary for this extraordinary world. James found her there 15 minutes later, his face contorted between fury and guilt. "I'm sorry," he began, but Emma interrupted him. "Why didn't you defend me?" Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it he hadn't heard before. "I sat there while your mother basically called me inadequate, inappropriate, insufficient, and you said nothing." "Emma, is it because part of you agrees with her?" she asked, tears finally falling. "Because you think I'm too young, too simple, too unsophisticated to be with you?" James reached for her face, but she pulled back. The pain in his eyes was like a physical blow, but Emma couldn't stop. Years of insecurities, weeks of feeling judged and found wanting, all came out in a torrent of words she couldn't contain. "I'm 21 years old, James. I haven't traveled the world. I don't speak 5 languages. I don't know which fork to use at a formal dinner, or how to talk about financial derivatives. And if that's not enough for you, if you need someone like Victoria who knows all the right things and acts the right way, then tell me now before I fall more in love than I already am." The silence that followed was absolute. Emma realized what she'd said only when the words were already floating between them, impossible to retrieve. She had completely exposed herself, admitting feelings she hadn't planned to confess, vulnerabilities she had tried to hide. James closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and this time when he reached for her face, she didn't pull back. His hands framed her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't defend you against my mother, because I was paralyzed by my own cowardice. Because I've spent 40 years learning to pick my battles with her, to keep family peace even when it suffocates me. But you're right. I should have defended you. I should have said exactly what I'm going to tell you now." His thumbs wiped the tears from her cheeks. "I don't need someone who knows how to talk about financial markets or who can properly represent my family at social events. I need someone who reminds me why I built all this in the first place. Someone who makes me laugh, who challenges me, who sees the man behind the bank balance. And that person is you, Emma, with your 21 years and your love for dusty books and your way of biting your lip when you're nervous. You. But your family, screw them," he said with vehemence that surprised her. "I've spent too much time living according to other people's expectations, building the life they thought I should have, with the woman they thought I should want. And I was miserable. But with you," his forehead rested against hers, "with you I can breathe." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words, the raw love in them, but she also felt the weight of reality, of the differences between them that wouldn't disappear simply because they wanted them to. "I need time," she whispered, "to think, to process all this. I'm not ending things with you. I just need space to understand who I am in all of this." James nodded slowly, though she could see the pain in his eyes. He kissed her forehead with a tenderness that broke something in her chest, then drove her home in silence, their hands intertwined between them like a tacit promise. That night, Emma sat in her small apartment, surrounded by all the books that defined her world before James, and knew with painful certainty that she had crossed a threshold from which she couldn't return. She was no longer the same girl she had been, but she also didn't know who she was becoming, and that uncertainty was the most frightening thing of all. For 2 weeks, Emma didn't see James. She returned to her routine at the library, but everything felt different now. The books that were once her sanctuary now seemed like just paper and ink. The silence that once consoled her now amplified the emptiness. Even the smell of old paper, her favorite scent, couldn't fill the hole that had opened in her chest. He respected her request for space, but his presence was felt in the details. A coffee from her favorite cafe waiting at the counter every morning, always exactly how she liked it. Her rare edition of Emily Dickinson poems that appeared on her desk without a note, but which she recognized as something she'd casually mentioned weeks ago. Small reminders that he was waiting, without pressuring her. It was her mother who finally confronted her. Emma had avoided talking about James, but mothers have ways of knowing. One evening, her mother appeared unannounced at her apartment, carrying shopping bags and determination in her tired eyes. "Tell me what's going on," she ordered, settling into the only comfortable chair in the small space. "And don't tell me nothing, because I've known you since you were born, sweetie." Emma hadn't planned to tell her everything, but once she started, the words came out like a torrent. She talked about James, about the age difference, about his disapproving family, about her own fears of not being enough. Her mother listened in silence, her expressive face passing through a range of emotions: concern, understanding, and finally, something that looked like pride. "Do you know how old I was when I met your father?" she asked, when Emma finally ran out of words. 19. He was 32, and let me tell you, the world didn't approve, my family didn't approve. And in the end, it didn't work out, but not because of the age difference. Emma looked up, surprised. Her mother rarely spoke about her father, who had abandoned them when she was a baby. "It didn't work out because he wasn't willing to choose me over his family's expectations," her mother continued, "because when things got difficult, he decided his comfort was more important than his love for me. The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether you're good enough for James's world. It's whether he's willing to choose you when it's hard to do so." Those words resonated in Emma for days, and then came the moment that forced her hand in a completely unexpected way. She was closing the library on a rainy afternoon when she saw a woman waiting outside, tall, impeccably dressed in a cream suit that was probably designer, with black hair styled in a perfectly elegant bun. There was something predatory in the way she smiled when their eyes met. "You must be Emma," she said, her voice silky with a touch of mockery. "I'm Victoria. I think James mentioned me." The world seemed to tilt under Emma's feet. This was the woman James's family approved of, the one who knew all the right things and acted the right way. And she was stunning, clearly experienced, with confidence that emanated like expensive perfume. "What do you want?" Emma asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Victoria laughed, a cultivated and musical sound. "Oh, darling, nothing dramatic. I just wanted to see with my own eyes the girl who has James so entertained." Her eyes traveled over Emma with merciless assessment. "I must admit, you're not at all what I expected. You're very young." "I'm 21 years old," Emma said, raising her chin defiantly. "Exactly my point," Victoria responded softly. "Look, I'm not going to be cruel. I just want you to understand something. James and I have history. We've known each other for 15 years. I know how he likes his coffee, which side of the bed he prefers, how to calm him when he has those terrible migraines. I know exactly how to touch him, to make him forget his own name." Each word was a calculated stab, and Emma felt every one. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you're sweet, and you don't deserve to get hurt when this inevitably falls apart," Victoria said. And for a moment, there was something that almost seemed genuine in her expression. "James has a pattern. He falls in love with the idea of something new, something different. But in the end, he always comes back to what's familiar, to what he knows, to me." "You're lying," Emma said, but her voice trembled. "Am I?" "Ask him who consoled him when his mother had her heart attack last year. Ask him who he talks to when he has real business problems. Ask him who was in his bed exactly 3 months ago, before he met you and decided to play this game of rescuing the innocent damsel." Victoria walked away then, her heels echoing on the wet pavement, leaving Emma paralyzed under the library's awning. The other woman's words reverberated in her head, sowing doubts that expanded like ink in water. Emma walked home in a daze, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. When she reached her building, she found James waiting on the steps, soaked by the rain, his face a mask of concern. "Victoria came to see you," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I saw her leaving here." "Emma, whatever she said—" "Is it true," Emma interrupted, "that you were with her 3 months ago?" James closed his eyes, and that pause was all the confirmation she needed. "Yes," he said finally. "But let me explain." "What's there to explain?" Emma's voice broke. "You were with her right before you met me, and she says you always come back to her, that this, us, is just another one of your phases." "That's not true," James said fiercely, reaching for her hands. Yes, Victoria and I have history. Yes, I was with her 3 months ago because it was easy, because it was familiar, because I was tired of being alone. But then I met you, and everything changed. Emma, you're not a phase, you're— What am I? Emma asked, tears mixing with rain on her face. Your project? Your fantasy of saving the poor library girl? A way to feel better about yourself? You're the person who makes me want to be better, James said, his voice broken. The person who reminds me there's more to life than accumulating wealth and power. The person I see when I close my eyes at night, and the first one I think of when I wake up. And when you look at me 5 years from now, when I'm 26 and you're 45, Emma asked, when I'm still too young, too inexperienced, too different from your world, will you still think the same? Yes, he said without hesitation, because what we have has nothing to do with age. It has to do with connection, with understanding, with choosing each other every day. Emma pulled away, needing space to think, to breathe. I need you to go, she said softly. Please, James. I just need to be alone. He nodded slowly, the pain evident in every line of his body. But before leaving, he turned one last time. I love you, he said simply. That's the only thing I know for certain right now. I love you in a way I didn't know was possible. And when you're ready to talk, I'll be waiting. A day, a week, a month, it doesn't matter, I'll be waiting. Emma watched him walk away in the rain, his figure eventually disappearing into the wet darkness of the street. She climbed to her apartment on heavy legs and sank onto her bed, finally allowing herself to cry. Not just for James, or at least not only for him. She cried for the girl she had been before meeting him, the one who was safe in her small world. She cried for the woman she was becoming, scared but determined. She cried for the love she felt, so strong it hurt, so real it transformed her. And sometime between the tears and dawn, she made her decision. She wouldn't be defined by her age or her inexperience. She wouldn't allow either his family's disapproval or Victoria's warnings to dictate her future. If she was going to be with James, it would be on her own terms, as a woman who knew her worth, not as a girl who needed saving. When the sun finally rose over New York's rooftops, Emma rose with it, ready to choose her own path, no matter how frightening it might be. Emma called James 3 days later, her voice firm when she asked to meet at Central Park. Neutral ground, open space, where they could talk without the pressures of fancy restaurants or the intimacy of closed spaces. He agreed without asking questions, and that, more than anything else, told her how scared he was of losing her. They met near Bethesda Fountain, where sunlight filtered through tree canopies, creating mosaics of light and shadow on the concrete ground. James looked different somehow, more vulnerable, with dark circles suggesting sleepless nights similar to hers. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a linen shirt, as if he too had needed to leave behind the trappings of his world for a moment. "Thank you for coming," Emma said, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'd come to the end of the world if you asked," he responded simply. They sat on a bench overlooking the lake, where ducks glided serenely over the water, as if the world weren't falling apart. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence filling with sounds of children laughing in the distance and the whisper of leaves in the autumn breeze. "I've been thinking a lot," Emma finally began, "about us, about what I want, about who I want to be. And I realized something. I've spent my whole life letting others define my worth. My family, who saw me as the quiet daughter who never caused trouble. My co-workers, who saw me as the shy girl in the back. Even myself, who saw me as someone who didn't deserve more than I already had." James started to speak, but she raised a hand. "Let me finish. Meeting you changed that. You showed me a world I didn't know existed, made me feel things I didn't know I could feel, but I also got lost in it. I started defining myself by your world, by whether I was good enough for it, by whether I could fit into it. And that's not right." "Emma, I'm not done," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm 21 years old, James. And yes, that's young. Yes, there are experiences I haven't had, lessons I haven't learned, but that doesn't make me less valuable. It doesn't make me less capable of knowing what I want. And what I want," her voice faltered slightly but continued, "what I want is you. But I need you to understand something. I can't be your project. I can't be the girl you save or transform. I need space to grow on my own, to make my own mistakes, to find out who I am outside your shadow." James looked at her with an intensity that made her feel naked, but not in an uncomfortable way, as if he could see straight into her soul and loved what he saw there. "Then teach me how," he said finally. "Teach me how to love you without suffocating you, how to support you without controlling you, how to stand beside you without casting my shadow over you. Because, Emma, I'll learn. I'll change. Whatever it takes." It was the raw vulnerability in his voice that broke Emma's last defenses. She moved toward him, and his arms immediately enveloped her, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile. She buried her face in his chest, breathing his familiar scent, feeling safe for the first time in days. "Let's go slow," she murmured against his shirt. "Really this time. No expensive dresses or fancy dinners that make me feel like I'm playing at being an adult. Just us, getting to know each other, no pressure." "Whatever you want," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "At your pace. Always." The following months were proof of that promise. James learned to give her space, not to solve all her problems with money or influence. When Emma mentioned wanting to take literature classes at NYU, he didn't offer to pay. Instead, he helped her research scholarships and work-study programs. When she expressed interest in writing, he didn't hire a professional editor. He simply listened to her read her first clumsy attempts and encouraged her to keep trying. But the differences between their worlds didn't disappear just because they chose to ignore them. The real test came when James had to attend an important charity gala, where his presence was crucial for closing a significant business deal. He needed a date, and after much discussion, Emma agreed to accompany him. The preparation was an exhausting process. There were discussions about which dress to wear, how to style her hair, what jewelry would be appropriate. Each decision seemed laden with meaning, each choice an opportunity to fail. Emma felt like a doll being prepared for display, and it reopened all the insecurities she thought she'd overcome. On the night of the event, standing before the mirror in her emerald green silk dress, Emma almost backed out. The woman staring back looked beautiful, sophisticated, completely different from who she really was, and that terrified her. "So you look stunning," James said from the doorway, but she could hear the caution in his voice as if he could sense her imminent panic. "I don't belong there," Emma whispered. "Everyone will know the moment I walk in. They'll see I'm a fraud." James crossed the room and took her hands, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. Those people, all those people who'll be there tonight, most of them are frauds, wearing expensive costumes, playing roles they think they should play. You're the only real thing in my life, Emma. And if you walk into that ballroom being exactly who you are, without pretense, without falseness, you'll be the most authentic person there." His words helped, but didn't eliminate the knot of anxiety in her stomach as they drove to the Plaza Hotel where the event was being held. The lobby was a sea of diamonds and tuxedos, of cultivated laughter and calculated conversations. Emma clung to James's arm like a lifeline, smiling politely as he introduced her to an endless series of people whose names she immediately forgot. Everything was going relatively well until they encountered a group that included Mrs. Hartwell and Caroline. James's mother assessed her with a look that could freeze blood, while his sister smiled with barely contained malice. "Emma," Mrs. Hartwell said with false sweetness, "how lovely you look tonight. That dress is very daring for someone your age." The comment, seemingly innocent, was heard by several around them. Emma felt her cheeks burn, aware of the curious glances turning toward her. She was too young for this dress, too young for this event, too young for the man at her side. "I think she looks perfect," James said firmly, his hand squeezing Emma's in silent warning to his mother. "Of course you do, darling," Mrs. Hartwell responded. "You've always had unique taste." The venom in that last word was unmistakable, and then, as if it had been choreographed for maximum effect, Victoria appeared. She wore a stunning red dress that probably cost more than Emma's annual rent, and moved through the ballroom with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged exactly there. "James," she purred, kissing his cheek with a familiarity that made something twist painfully in Emma's stomach. "It's been so long." Her eyes slid to Emma with barely veiled contempt. "And Emma, of course. What a surprise to see you here." The next hour was torture. Emma watched Victoria move through the room, speaking the language of that world with fluency she would never have. She watched her casually touch James's arm during conversation, laugh at his comments with an intimacy born from years of knowing each other, and she saw, in the faces of those around them, the approval she would never have. At some point, Emma excused herself to go to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe away from the assessing stares. She found Victoria in the powder room, touching up her perfect makeup in front of the gilded mirror. "This must be very difficult for you," Victoria said, meeting Emma's eyes in the reflection. "Being here knowing you'll never really be one of us." "Why do you do this?" Emma asked, her voice more tired than angry. "Why do you care so much?" Victoria turned, and for the first time, there was something that seemed vulnerable in her expression. "Because I love him," she said simply. "I've loved him for 15 years, and I was willing to wait, to be patient, because I knew he'd eventually see we belong together. But then you came along with your wide eyes and your innocence, and he looks at you like you're water in the desert." Her voice hardened. "So yes, I want you gone. Not because you're a bad person, but because while you're here, he won't see me." The brutal honesty of the confession left Emma speechless. For the first time, she saw Victoria not as a villain, but as another woman in love, fighting for someone she wanted. And that somehow was even worse. "I can't promise I'll leave," Emma said finally. "But I can promise that if he chooses to go back to you, I won't fight for him. Because I want someone who chooses me unequivocally, without doubts or second thoughts." Victoria studied her for a long moment, something like respect filtering into her expression. "You're stronger than I thought," she admitted. Maybe you deserve a fair chance after all." They didn't become friends, but some of the poison left their rivalry. When they returned to the main ballroom, Emma had new determination. She wouldn't let these people make her feel less. She wouldn't apologize for her age or inexperience or different world. She found James on the terrace, looking at the nighttime city with a thoughtful expression. She approached and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I want to leave," she said simply. "Not because I can't handle this, but because I don't want to. This isn't my life, James. Maybe someday I'll navigate these waters better, but tonight I just want to be with you, away from all this." He looked at her, something shining in his eyes that could be relief or admiration or love, probably all three. "Hot dogs at Central Park?" he suggested with a smile. "Hot dogs at Central Park," she agreed. They left the gala early, driving through New York's illuminated streets to a 24-hour hot dog cart James knew. There, still in their elegant clothes, they ate hot dogs with everything and drank soda, laughing at how ridiculous they looked. And Emma realized something. She didn't need to fit into his world. She just needed him to be willing to step out of his once in a while to meet her in the middle. But that realization came with a cost. The next day, photos of their early departure from the gala circulated on gossip blogs, speculating about problems in their relationship. James's business partners expressed concerns. His mother called, furious. And for the first time, Emma saw the real cost of their choice to be together. It wasn't just social or personal, but professional. Their relationship was affecting his business, his reputation, his position in a world that valued appearances above all else. "This isn't fair to you," Emma said one night, when the pressures seemed to crush them from all sides. "Fairness has nothing to do with love," James responded, "and I chose you. That doesn't change just because it's hard." But something had changed. Emma could feel it in the tension in his shoulders, in the tense phone calls she heard through closed doors, in the way he sometimes looked at her as if calculating whether she was worth everything he was losing. And that more than anything his family or Victoria could say planted the seed of doubt that grew in the darkness of her sleepless nights. Was love enough when it cost so much? The cracks began showing in small ways at first. James cancelling plans at the last minute for urgent meetings. Emma finding excuses to work late at the library. Conversations that felt increasingly like duty rather than desire. They weren't fighting, which somehow was worse. They were simply drifting apart, each retreating to their separate worlds. Emma started spending more time with people her own age, classmates from NYU, where she'd finally enrolled in night classes. There was freedom in being with people who didn't know about James, who saw her only as Emma, the girl who loved literature and had passionate opinions about narrative structure. With them she could laugh without weight, dream without limits, be 21 without apologizing for it. One of her classmates, Tyler, began showing interest in her. He was close to her age, 23, studying journalism with ambitions of writing novels someday. He was easy to talk to, easy to be around, easy in ways James never had been. There were no complications of age differences or incompatible worlds, just two young people sharing cheap coffee and impossible dreams. Emma never crossed any lines, but she was aware of the temptation, aware that Tyler represented a simpler life, a path that didn't require her to constantly stretch and fight to fit in. And she hated that she was considering it, hated that part of her wondered if loving James was worth all the pain it seemed to bring. James was struggling too. His business faced challenges that demanded all his attention, and the pressures from his family had intensified. Mrs. Hartwell had made it clear that if he continued with Emma, certain doors in New York society would close. It wasn't just about family approval. It was about contracts that depended on social connections, about investors who valued stability and proper appearances. One particularly bad night after losing an important deal he thought was secured, James arrived at Emma's apartment later than planned. She was at her desk, working on an essay for class, and barely heard him come in. "Sorry," he said, his voice tired. "The meeting ran long." "They always run long lately," Emma responded without looking up from her computer. The silence that followed was tense. James sat on the edge of the bed, loosening his tie with mechanical movements. Emma finally closed her laptop and turned to him, really seeing for the first time in weeks the exhaustion on his face, the stress lines around his eyes. "What's happening to us?" she asked softly. James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd learned to recognize. "I don't know. I feel like I'm constantly failing you, like I can't give you what you need and simultaneously handle everything else. And I hate feeling this way. Hate that something that should be good feels so difficult." Emma moved to sit beside him, their thighs touching in the narrow space. She took his hand, noticing how tense it was. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Choosing me, everything it's costing." James looked at her with such intensity it stole her breath. "Not for a second," he said vehemently. "Emma, difficult doesn't mean wrong. It means we're fighting for something worthwhile, don't you see that?" "Sometimes I'm not sure what I'm seeing," she admitted. "I see you exhausted all the time. I see the business opportunities you lose because of me. I see how your family treats you now. And I wonder if you'd be better off—" "Don't," James interrupted. "Don't finish that sentence. I'm not better off without you. Maybe richer without you, maybe more successful by superficial standards. But better, not even close." Emma wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the certainty in his voice, but there was something else she needed to say, something that had been growing in her chest like a stone. "I met someone," she said quietly. "At school, his name is Tyler, and he's easy." "Not in the way you think," she hurried to add when she saw James's expression. "Nothing's happened, but he makes me laugh effortlessly. He challenges me intellectually without making me feel inadequate. And he's my age, and he understands the references I make, and—" Her voice broke. "And I hate myself for even noticing." James went rigid, and Emma could see the pain cross his face before he could mask it. He stood, walking to the window, his back to her. "Do you want to be with him?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "No," Emma said immediately, also standing. "James, no. I'm just being honest because we promised that. We promised not to hide things. And I've been confused." He turned, and there was raw vulnerability in his expression that made her heart ache. "I understand I'm older, that I've lived more, but I've never cared less because of it. If anything, it makes every moment with you feel more precious, because I know how rare this is, what we have." He closed the distance between them. "But if you need to explore, if you need to be with someone who's more appropriate for your age, I'll understand. I'll let you go, even if it kills me to do it." Emma shook her head violently, tears finally falling. "I don't want to explore. I don't want Tyler or anyone else. I just want this to be easier. I want to stop feeling like every step forward comes with 2 steps back. I want to stop worrying that one day you'll wake up and realize you wasted your life with someone who wasn't woman enough for you." James took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me very carefully. You're not wasting anything. You're not insufficient. You're everything. And yes, it's hard. Yes, we're being tested in ways we didn't anticipate. But I didn't build everything I've built by giving up when things get difficult, and I'm not going to start now with what matters most." They kissed then, desperate and needy, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors adrift. And for that night, it was enough. They made love with an intensity that bordered on desperation, each touch a reaffirmation, each sigh a promise. But in the darkness before dawn, while James slept exhausted beside her, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She loved this man with a fierceness that scared her. But was love enough? Could it sustain them through all the external pressures, all the fundamental differences between their worlds, all the ways life seemed to conspire to separate them? She had no answers, only the unsettling certainty that something would have to change soon, or they would break in ways no amount of love could repair. The break came, as momentous things often do, in a completely unexpected way. Emma had been accepted into a writing program in Boston, a 3-month opportunity that included housing and a small stipend. It was everything she'd dreamed of, a validation of her talent that didn't depend on her connection to James. She should have been euphoric. Instead, she felt sick with anxiety. Boston meant being apart for months at a time when their relationship already felt fragile. It meant missing important events in each other's lives, communicating through screens instead of touch. It meant testing whether what they had could survive physical distance in addition to all the other distances that already existed between them. She told James at a neutral cafe, a public place where they couldn't make a scene. She watched his face as he processed the news, seeing every emotion pass: surprise, pride, concern, and finally, something that looked like resignation. "It's an incredible opportunity," he said finally. "You should take it." "That's it?" Emma asked, something in her hoping he'd fight harder, give her reasons to stay. "You should take it?" James sighed, stirring his coffee without really drinking it. "What do you want me to say, Emma? To ask you not to go, to choose staying here with me instead of pursuing your dreams? I can't do that. I won't do that to you. But nothing," he interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "So look, we're barely holding it together here. Adding 1,500 miles of distance and 3 months of separation." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Emma felt something break inside her. She had wanted him to fight for them, to say they'd find a way to make it work. Instead, he seemed to be accepting the inevitability of their separation, as if he'd already made peace with it. "Maybe we need a break," she said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them. "While I'm in Boston, no expectations, no pressure, just time for us both to figure out what we really want." The silence that followed was absolute. James looked at her as if she'd just slapped him, his face draining of color. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible. A break? Emma didn't know what she wanted. She knew she was tired of fighting, of feeling inadequate, of seeing the cost of their relationship reflected in James's eyes. She knew something had to change. "I think so," she whispered. "Just for the 3 months. To give us space to breathe, to think clearly. And then when I come back we can decide if this is something we can sustain long term." James nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He stood, leaving money on the table with mechanical movements. "I understand," he said, though his voice suggested he didn't, not really. "I wish you the best in Boston, Emma, I really do." He left without kissing her, without touching her, and somehow that was more final than any argument could have been. Emma sat in that cafe long after her cup grew cold, feeling simultaneously relieved and shattered. The 2 weeks before her departure to Boston were torture. They didn't talk, didn't see each other, both maintaining the distance she'd asked for. Emma told herself it was for the best, that they needed this time, but every night she fell asleep crying, and every morning she woke with her chest tight with regret. Her friends noticed, of course. Tyler, in particular, seemed attuned to her misery. He invited her out to cheer her up, nights of conversation and laughter that momentarily distracted from the pain. He was good to her in simple, uncomplicated ways. And when he kissed her one night after too many beers, Emma almost let herself get carried away, almost allowed him to distract her from the agony of losing James. But she pulled away at the last moment, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't. I'm still... It wouldn't be fair to you." Tyler nodded with understanding, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "It's the older guy, right?" he asked gently. "The businessman." Emma nodded, unable to trust her voice. "He must love you a lot," Tyler said, "because even trying to get over him, you're still his." Those words resonated in Emma for days. Trying to get over him. Was that what she was doing? Trying to convince herself she didn't love James, that she could just move on and find something easier with someone else? And if it was, why did it feel so completely wrong? The night before her departure to Boston, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She took a cab to James's office, knowing he'd probably still be there, working late as he always did when stressed. The security guard recognized her and let her up without questions. She found James at his desk, surrounded by papers, staring at his computer screen, with eyes that suggested he wasn't really seeing anything. He looked terrible, with days of beard growth and wrinkled clothes he'd probably worn for more than 24 hours. "Emma," he said, standing abruptly when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't leave without telling you." Her voice broke. "Without telling you that I made a mistake. Asking for a break was cowardice. I was scared to keep fighting, scared to keep not knowing if we were strong enough to survive everything. But these 2 weeks without you have been the worst of my life. And I realized something. I'd rather fight with you every day than live in peace without you." James crossed the office in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with desperation that echoed hers. He kissed her as if he were dying, and she were air, as if he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks and could finally exhale. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured against her lips. "I thought you'd decided I wasn't worth it." "You're the only thing that's worth it," Emma responded. "Everything else is just noise." They made love in his office, on the leather couch that probably cost more than her entire apartment, surrounded by views of New York glittering in the darkness. It was different this time, rawer, more honest. No pretenses of perfection, just 2 people desperately clinging to what they'd almost lost. Afterward, lying intertwined while the city breathed beyond the panoramic windows, Emma traced meaningless patterns on James's chest. "I'm still going to Boston," she said softly, "because I need this for me. I need to prove I can succeed on my own. But not as a break. As your girlfriend who's pursuing a dream and will be back in 3 months, if you still want me." "I'll always want you," James promised. 3 months, 3 years, 3 decades. "That's not going to change." "How can you be so sure?" Emma asked. "How can you know it won't change?" James made her look at him, his expression serious in the dim light filtering from the city. "Because I spent 40 years building a life that looked impressive from the outside, but felt empty inside. And then I met you, and for the first time I cared about something more than success and profit. You taught me there are other ways to measure a life. And that's not something I'm going to forget just because you're in Boston for a few months." Emma pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I'm so scared," she admitted, "of not being enough, of failing you, of waking up one day and realizing we wasted our time trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken." "Then let's be scared together," James said. "But let's not let fear separate us, because that's the only thing that will really break us." They spent that last night together, not sleeping, talking and making love and simply holding each other. And when dawn broke over New York, painting the sky in pinks and golds, Emma knew with certainty that she'd found something rare. Not perfect, not easy, but completely theirs. Boston awaited, and all the challenges that would come with distance and time apart. But for the first time since it all began, Emma didn't feel like she was running away. She was consciously choosing her path, trusting that James would be waiting when she returned. Because that's what real love did. It didn't demand perfection, but it required presence. And finally, they were both present, fully committed to the beautiful difficulty of what they'd chosen to build together. Boston was transformative in ways Emma hadn't anticipated. Away from the pressures of New York, from the shadow of James's world and the weight of expectations, she flourished. Her writing deepened, her confidence grew. Her voice as a writer emerged with a clarity that surprised her. The first days were the hardest. She missed James with a physical intensity that left her breathless. But gradually, she learned to live in the distance, to find joy in her separate routine. They talked every night, video calls where they told each other the mundane details of their days. He told her about meetings and business problems, and she shared fragments of her writing and reflections on workshops. But it wasn't just surface talk. Without physical distractions, they were forced to communicate in deeper ways. They discussed philosophy, shared fears they'd never verbalized, explored the complexities of who they were beyond their relationship. And in that process, something fundamentally shifted. Emma stopped seeing her youth as a deficit and began seeing it as a unique perspective. Her professors in Boston valued her fresh voice, her way of approaching classic themes from unexpected angles. For the first time, she felt intellectually powerful, capable of holding her own in discussions with people decades older. She made friends in the program, people of all ages and backgrounds who shared her passion for words. There was a 60-year-old writer who'd recently divorced and was rediscovering her voice. A 35-year-old poet who wrote about loss and transformation. A 24-year-old novelist who was navigating her own complex relationship with an age difference. It was this last one, Sophia, who became her confidant. During long nights with Massachusetts wine and views of the Charles River, they shared their stories. Sophia was in a relationship with a man 20 years older and had walked many of the same emotional paths as Emma. "The age difference never goes away," Sophia said one night, "but it stops mattering when you find someone who sees you as an equal despite it, when they respect you enough to let you grow without trying to mold you into what they think you should be." Those words resonated deeply with Emma. James was letting her grow. He wasn't trying to control her experience in Boston or direct her decisions. When she mentioned being offered the opportunity to stay an additional month to work on her first novel, he encouraged her without hesitation, despite it meaning more time apart. "This is important to you," he said. "I'm not going to be the reason you miss opportunities." That level of support, of genuinely prioritizing her growth over his own convenience, showed Emma something crucial. James wasn't in this for ego or control. He was in this because he truly loved her, all of her, including her ambitions and needs for independence. Meanwhile, in New York, James was also going through his own transformation. Emma's absence forced him to confront truths about his life he'd been avoiding. He realized how much he'd been using work to fill emotional voids, how superficial many of his relationships beyond her were. He started therapy, something Emma had gently suggested, but that he'd always dismissed as unnecessary. The therapist helped him untangle his need for control from his childhood traumas, to understand that his panic about losing Emma was connected to his early abandonment by his father. He also confronted his family in ways he'd never had the courage to do. During a particularly tense dinner, he set clear boundaries with his mother. "I'm going to marry Emma," he declared, though he hadn't even asked her yet. "And you need to decide if you can accept that and be part of our lives, or if you're going to continue being an obstacle, because I'm not choosing your approval over my happiness anymore." Mrs. Hartwell, shocked by her son's uncharacteristic firmness, finally began reconsidering her stance. It wasn't a dramatic overnight change, but it was a beginning. James also visited Boston twice during Emma's 3 months. The first visit was planned, a weekend where they explored the city together like tourists. It was light and romantic, without the pressures of their normal lives. They walked the Freedom Trail, ate lobster rolls at small stands, made love in her small apartment with windows overlooking narrow streets filled with New England light. The second visit was spontaneous. Emma had had a particularly difficult day, doubting her writing, questioning whether she had the talent to make this a career. James showed up unannounced, just to hold her while she cried, to remind her of her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "That's what partners do," he said. "They show up, not because it's convenient, but because the other needs them." It was in that moment Emma fully understood what they had. It wasn't just attraction or compatibility or even love. It was partnership. Two people choosing, actively and consciously, to build something together, support each other, grow side by side. Her writing also evolved during this time. She began working on a semi-autobiographical novel about a young woman navigating a relationship with an age difference, exploring not just the challenges, but also the growth that came with it. She wrote with brutal honesty about her insecurities, fears, moments of doubt. And in that process of externalizing her experience, she found clarity. She realized she'd always defined her worth in relation to others, her mother, her employers, James, but at 21, she was finally beginning to define herself on her own terms. And that person was stronger, more capable, more complete than she'd imagined. When her program ended, and it was time to return to New York, Emma felt simultaneous excitement and nervousness. She'd grown so much during these months. Would she still fit in the life she'd left behind? Would James recognize the woman returning? Would they still fit together the way they had? James was waiting at Penn Station, and the moment their eyes met, all her doubts evaporated. He looked at her with the same love, but there was also something new. Respect. Not the condescending respect of treating someone younger with kid gloves, but the genuine respect of an equal. They embraced in the middle of the rushing crowd of travelers, holding each other as if they could melt into one person. And Emma knew with every fiber of her being that they'd survived the test. Not just survived, but emerged stronger. "I love you," she murmured against his chest. "More than when I left." "I love you," he responded, kissing her hair. "Exactly as you are." And that acceptance, that celebration of who she was without trying to change or mold her, was the greatest gift he could have given. She didn't need to be older, more sophisticated, more worldly. She just needed to be herself, evolving and growing at her own pace. As they drove back through the familiar streets of New York, sharing stories of their months apart, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of absence of conflict, but the peace of knowing she'd found her place, her person, her home. The months after Emma's return from Boston were of conscious reconstruction. They'd survived the separation, but now they had to learn to live together again, integrating the changes both had experienced. Emma moved into a larger apartment, financed by the sales of her first short stories published in literary magazines. It was important to her that it be her space, paid for with her money, not another gift from James. He understood that without her having to explain extensively, and that understanding meant everything. The relationship found a new rhythm. Emma spent mornings writing, afternoons working part-time at the library she loved. James adjusted his schedule to work more from home, creating space for lunches together, for evening walks through Central Park, for unhurried conversations. But the biggest change came in how they related to each other's worlds. James began attending Emma's literary readings, sitting in audiences at small bookstores where she read her work. Initially, he felt out of place in these bohemian spaces filled with students and emerging writers, but he learned to appreciate the art and passion that filled them. Emma, for her part, made a conscious effort to better understand his world, not to fit in, but to comprehend. She attended seminars on finance, read about his industry, learned the language he spoke in his professional life, not because she felt she had to, but because she wanted to know all parts of him, even those that didn't naturally resonate with her. The real turning point came when Mrs. Hartwell finally extended an olive branch. She invited Emma to lunch, just the two of them, at a quiet restaurant away from curious eyes. Emma was tempted to refuse, but James encouraged her to go. "Give her a chance," he said. "She's trying in her way." The lunch started tense, full of uncomfortable silences and forced conversation. But then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Hartwell said something that completely changed the tone. "My husband was 12 years older than me," she admitted, her fingers playing with the edge of her napkin. "And my family didn't approve. They thought he was too old for me, that he came from the wrong circumstances. But I loved him and we got married anyway." Emma looked up, surprised. This was a vulnerability she never expected from the formidable matriarch. "It was difficult," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "The differences between us created tensions. He died when James was 15, leaving me alone to raise two teenagers, while navigating a world that didn't respect young widows. And I thought if I could ensure James married someone appropriate, someone from our world, I'd spare him those difficulties. But I'm not appropriate," Emma said softly, without bitterness, just stating a fact. "Not according to the standards I used," the older woman admitted. "But I've watched my son these months. I've seen how he talks about you, how he changes when he's with you, and it reminds me of how his father looked at me. Like I was the center of his universe." Tears pricked Emma's eyes. "I don't want to take him from you," she said. "I know you already lost your husband young. I don't want to be another source of family division." Mrs. Hartwell reached across the table, taking Emma's hand in a gesture that surprised her. "You're not dividing him. I was. With my expectations, my fears, my need to control his life because I couldn't control my own." She paused. "I can't promise it will be easy. I can't pretend I fully understand your world, or that I don't worry about the age difference, but I can promise to try, for James, and maybe, with time, for you too. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a beginning. Emma left that lunch feeling lighter, as if a weight she didn't know she was carrying had been lifted. She finally understood that Mrs. Hartwell's opposition had never really been about her, but about a mother's fear that her son would suffer. Meanwhile, Emma was also building relationships in James's world. She met his business partners in more casual contexts, where she could be herself instead of being on display. Some remained skeptical, but others began seeing what James saw: her intelligence, her genuine kindness, her unique perspective. There was one particular moment during a business dinner where everything clicked. One of James's partners had made a dismissive comment about literature being a worthless pursuit compared to real business. Emma, instead of shrinking as she might have before, responded with grace, but firmness. Literature shapes how societies think, how they understand human experience, she said. Business makes money, which is important, but art makes meaning. And honestly, I think we need both. The silence that followed was long, and Emma felt momentary panic that she'd overstepped. But then James took her hand under the table, squeezing it proudly, and the partner, after a moment, nodded with what might have been respect. Valid point, he admitted. Never thought of it that way. It was a small moment, but significant. Emma had found her voice in James's world, not by trying to imitate him, but by remaining authentically herself. Her own career was also progressing in exciting ways. Her semi-autobiographical novel attracted interest from several publishers. The day she signed her first real book deal, with a modest but significant advance, she cried tears of joy and relief. She'd proven she could succeed on her own, that her worth wasn't tied to her relationship with James. He took her to dinner that night to celebrate, but not to a fancy restaurant. Instead, they returned to that hot dog cart where they'd gone after the gala, where they'd eaten in formal clothes and laughed at how ridiculous they looked. It was his way of honoring their journey, of acknowledging how far they'd come together. "I'm so proud of you," James said, raising his can of cheap soda. "Not just for the book deal, though that's amazing, but for who you've become, for the strength you've found, the voice you've claimed." "I couldn't have done it without you," Emma responded. "Yes, you could have," he said firmly. "You always had this in you, Emma. You just needed to believe it yourself." As they walked home that night, hands intertwined, Emma realized something. They'd stopped trying to fit into each other's worlds. Instead, they'd created something new, a hybrid space that honored both parts of who they were. It wasn't her world or his, but theirs, built with intention and love and a commitment to see each other fully. And in that space, finally, they could both breathe. Everything culminated on a night Emma would never forget. Nearly 2 years had passed since their first meeting in the library. 2 years of highs and lows, of growth and transformation, and James had planned something special, though Emma didn't know what. He took her to the Hamptons, to the same beachfront house where they'd had that transformative night months ago. But this time was different. Emma was no longer the shy 21-year-old girl, insecure in her own skin. Now, at 23, she was a published woman, confident in her voice, secure in her worth, and that transformation was reflected in everything, in the way she walked, in how she spoke, in the way she carried herself. On the first night at the house, they dined on the deck overlooking the ocean. Candles created dancing shadows, and the sound of waves provided a constant soundtrack. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing wine and laughter, and the easy intimacy of two people who'd learned to be completely present with each other. "There's something I want to show you," James said after dinner, taking her hand. He guided her down a path that descended to a private beach, where he'd prepared something breathtaking. The sand was illuminated with hundreds of candles protected from the wind in glass lanterns. Flower petals created a path to the water, and a blanket had been spread on the sand with more candles surrounding it. "James," Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "What is all this?" He led her to the center of the circle of light, his hands holding hers, his eyes reflecting the flicker of flames. "Emma, 2 years ago you entered my life when I least expected it. I was in that library hiding from the rain, but also hiding from my own empty life. And then I saw you with your hands full of books and your eyes full of wonder, and something in me awakened." Emma was crying openly now, not caring that tears ruined her makeup. "I've spent these 2 years watching you transform from a beautiful girl into an amazing woman," he continued. "I've seen you find your voice, pursue your dreams, claim your power, and every day I love you more than the one before, not despite your youth, but including everything you are." He knelt then, and Emma let out a sob. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a dark blue velvet box. But before opening it, he looked up with a vulnerability that echoed that first day in the library. "I know I'm 19 years older than you. I know our worlds are different, that our experiences don't always align. I know there will be people who judge, who question, who doubt. But I also know this: I'll never love anyone the way I love you. I'll never meet someone who challenges me, inspires me, completes me like you do. And I want to spend the rest of my life building our world together, supporting your dreams, celebrating your victories, holding you through your struggles." He opened the box, revealing a simple and beautiful ring, a solitaire emerald surrounded by small diamonds. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was stunning in its elegance. "Emma Collins, will you do me the honor of marrying me? Not because you need saving, not because I need to be complete, but because we choose to build something beautiful together, something worth all the challenge that comes with it." Emma fell to her knees before him, not caring that sand was ruining her dress. She held his face in her hands, looking into the honey-colored eyes that were the first thing she'd noticed about him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. They kissed then, surrounded by the glow of 100 candles, the sound of the ocean witnessing their promise. And it was different from all previous kisses. There was no desperate urgency or tentative hesitation. It was simply certainty, pure and absolute. They stayed on the beach for hours, lying on the blanket, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Emma twisted the ring on her finger, still unable to believe this was real. "Did you ever doubt?" she asked softly. "In these 2 years, did you ever think you made a mistake choosing me?" James turned to her, propping his head on his hand so he could look at her directly. "Honestly, there were moments when the pressures felt like too much, when the differences seemed insurmountable. But even in those moments, I never doubted my love for you. And that's what kept me fighting. The certainty that at the end of the day, I'd rather have you challenging me than spend a single day without you." "I had doubts too," Emma admitted. "Especially at the beginning. I wondered if I was mature enough, good enough in everything. But I learned something during our time apart. I didn't need to be enough for your world. I only needed to be enough for myself. And when I was, everything else fell into place." "Look at who we've become," James said in wonder. "Two people who almost destroyed themselves trying to fit into each other's expectations, who learned instead to create something completely new." The night deepened, and eventually they returned to the house. They made love with a tenderness that eclipsed all previous passion, each touch a promise, each kiss a vow. And afterward, lying intertwined while dawn painted the sky in pinks and golds, Emma knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her home. Not in a place, but in a person. In this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her when she was imperfect, who had waited while she found herself, who had demonstrated again and again that true love doesn't demand perfection, only presence. It doesn't ask for change, only growth. It doesn't seek possession, but partnership. "I love you," she murmured against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," he responded, kissing her hair. "My wife," the word echoed between them, new and strange but perfectly right. Wife, companion, partner, lover, friend, all the words that described what they were to each other, but also none of them fully captured the depth of their connection. As the sun rose fully, bathing their room in golden light, Emma closed her eyes and smiled. They'd survived the storm. They'd navigated the differences. They'd found their way to each other through all the obstacles life had placed in their path. And this was just the beginning. The rest of their lives stretched before them, full of infinite possibilities, unknown challenges, yet to be discovered joys. But they would face it together side by side, two people who had chosen to see beyond age and social expectations to find something rare and precious, true love, in all its complicated, beautiful, imperfect forms. 5 years later, Emma sat on the porch of their house outside New York City, a lukewarm cup of coffee in her hands and her laptop open showing the last page of her third novel. At 28 years old, she was an established author with a growing reputation in literary circles. Her second novel had won awards, and this third was generating anticipation in the publishing industry. But it wasn't her professional success that made her smile that sunny spring morning. It was the sound coming from the garden below, James's deep laughter mixing with their 2-year-old daughter's high-pitched giggles. Harper. Harper had been a surprise, arriving earlier than planned but perfect in every way. She had her father's honey-colored eyes and Emma's dark hair, and a personality that already promised to be formidable. Watching her grow, seeing James transform into a devoted and gentle father, had added dimensions to their love that Emma never imagined possible. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and moments later James appeared on the porch, carrying Harper, who had dirt on her dress and flower petals in her hair. "Someone decided the roses needed reorganizing," James said with feigned exasperation, but his eyes shone with adoration. "Pretty," Harper declared, offering Emma a handful of crushed petals as if they were precious treasures. "The prettiest," Emma agreed, kissing her daughter's forehead before the little one ran off again, chasing a butterfly that had captured her attention. James slid into the chair next to Emma, his hair showing more grey now at 47, but still as handsome as the day she'd met him. Perhaps more so because now she saw in his face all the shared experiences, all the overcome struggles, all the accumulated love. "How's the book coming?" he asked, glancing at her screen. "Finished," Emma responded with satisfaction. "I just need to read through it once more before sending it to my editor." "I'm so proud of you," he said, as he'd said hundreds of times over their years together, but it never became less meaningful. Emma leaned against his shoulder, feeling his familiar solidity. "You know what I was thinking about?" she asked. "About 5 years ago, when you proposed on that beach in the Hamptons. I was so scared then, so insecure about whether I could be what you needed. And now I realize the question was wrong from the start," Emma said. "It wasn't about being what you needed. It was about building a life together where we could both become who we were meant to be." James turned to look at her, really look at her, in the way he still did, as if memorizing every detail. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, and she could hear the echo of his own insecurities in the question. "About marrying so young? About tying your life to mine when you still had so much to experience?" Emma considered the question carefully, giving it the weight it deserved. "No regrets," she said finally, "but yes, wishes that it had been easier for us. Wishes that people hadn't judged so much, that your family had accepted faster, that I hadn't had to work so hard to prove myself. I'm sorry for that," James said softly, "for all the times my world made you feel less." "Don't apologize," Emma took his hand, "because all of that made me stronger. It forced me to find my voice, to stand up for my worth, to become someone I could depend on. And that person, I like who I am now. I wouldn't have gotten here without those struggles." Harper returned then, climbing onto Emma's lap with the effortless confidence of a child who's never doubted being loved. Emma wrapped her in her arms, breathing in her sweet scent of dirt and sunshine and innocence. "Mommy, Daddy, look," Harper said, pointing to a bird perched on the porch railing. "He's singing for us." All three listened in silence as the robin trilled its morning song. And in that simple moment, Emma felt the perfection of her life wash over her. Not perfection in the sense of flawless or without challenges, but perfection in the sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. Her relationship with James's family had improved significantly over time. Mrs. Hartwell, especially after Harper's birth, had softened in ways Emma never expected. The older matriarch now visited weekly, enjoying her grandmother role with an affection that suggested she might have been a different woman if the social pressures of her own era hadn't hardened her. Caroline, James's sister, had genuinely apologized the year before, admitting that her jealousy of her brother's happiness had made her cruel. Now they were, if not close, at least cordial, friendly even on occasions. And Victoria. Well, Victoria had married a Manhattan businessman, someone more appropriate for her world. She'd seen her at a charity event last year, and they'd exchanged polite smiles without the poison of the past. Time had softened even that old wound. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, studying her face. "About how far we've come," Emma responded. "How the 21-year-old girl in that library never would have imagined this life. This house, this family, this career. Everything seemed impossible then." "Was it?" Harper asked, though she clearly had no idea what they were talking about. "It was magical," Emma said, kissing her cheek. "Like a fairy tale, except this one was real." "Fairy tales end in happily ever after," James pointed out with a smile. "Do you think that's what this is?" Emma considered it. Life wasn't perfect. James still worked too many hours sometimes. She still struggled with doubts about her writing. They argued about finances, about parenting, about all the small things couples argue about. The age difference occasionally still surfaced in unexpected ways, like when their cultural references didn't match, or when their physical energy differed. "It's not happily ever after," she said finally. "It's better than that. It's happily imperfect, consciously chosen, constantly worked on. It's real." "Real," James repeated, testing the word. "Yeah, I like that better too." That afternoon, after Harper was put down for her nap, Emma and James found themselves on the porch again. It was their ritual, these stolen moments of quiet amid the demands of life and parenthood. "I want to show you something," Emma said, reaching for the box she'd brought from the study. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written during those 3 months in Boston when they were apart. Emma had kept them all, along with the ones James had sent her. "Do you remember these?" she asked, pulling one out at random. James took the envelope, his fingers tracing his own handwriting from years ago. "Every word," he said softly. He read aloud. "Emma, today I walked through Central Park alone, and every step reminded me of you. The places we shared feel empty without your presence. But they also remind me that you chose to come back, that when offered space and freedom, you chose me. That's a gift I'll never take for granted." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. Her younger self had needed that reassurance so much, that constant confirmation that she was chosen. "And this one," she said, pulling out one of her own letters. "James, I'm learning to be brave here, away from you. I'm finding my voice, claiming my power. And the scariest thing is I'm becoming someone who might not need you anymore. But here's the truth. I don't want to not need you. I want to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to." "You were so young," James said in wonder, "and yet so wise. You already knew what takes most people a lifetime to learn." "I had a good teacher," Emma responded. "You showed me what it was like to be truly seen, truly valued, and that gave me the courage to demand that from myself too." They spent the next hour reading old letters, remembering those challenging days when their love was new and scary and uncertain. It was like looking through a window at their past selves, seeing all the ways they'd grown and changed and evolved. "You know what I realized?" Emma said, carefully placing the letters back in the box. "Those letters are full of fear and insecurity and doubt. And yet, we persisted. We kept choosing each other through all of it. Because this is worth it," James said simply. "You're worth it." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in pinks and oranges, Harper woke from her nap. She ran to them, still sleepy-eyed, climbing onto James's lap with the effortless confidence of a child who's never doubted her safety. "Tell me a story," she demanded, snuggling against his chest. "What kind of story?" James asked, settling her comfortably. "A love story," Harper said decisively, "like Mommy and Daddy." Emma and James exchanged a glance, a full moment of silent communication. "Once upon a time," Emma began, her voice taking on the cadence of storytelling, "there was a young girl who lived in a library filled with other people's stories, and a man who had built an impressive empire but forgot how to feel alive. On a rainy day, their paths crossed in a place of books and silence." As she told their story, Emma realized this was what she was trying to capture in all her writing, this complicated, challenging, transformative love that had completely reshaped her life. It wasn't simple or easy, but it was real and beautiful and completely theirs. James watched her as she spoke, his eyes reflecting all the adoration she'd seen in them that first night on the terrace, when he'd held her while sounds of breaking crystal echoed at their feet. Except now, there was something more in his gaze too. Knowledge. The deep knowledge that comes from years of true partnership, from raising a child together, from navigating life's highs and lows side by side. When Emma finished the story, Harper was almost asleep again, her breathing soft and regular. But before drifting off completely, she murmured, "That's the best story." "Yes," Emma agreed softly, looking at James over their daughter's head. "Yes, it is." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the three of them remained on the porch, a family united by choice and love and unbreakable commitment. The age difference that once seemed so insurmountable was now just a footnote in their story, a characteristic of their relationship, but not its defining feature. They'd proven that love wasn't about numbers or social expectations or fitting perfectly into each other's worlds. It was about seeing someone completely, accepting them fully, and choosing to build something beautiful together despite all obstacles. Emma looked at the ring on her finger, the emerald catching the light of the emerging stars. She'd worn this ring for 5 years now, and it had come to represent not just James's promise to her, but their mutual promise, to stay present, to keep growing, to keep choosing each other every day. "I love you," she whispered, the words so familiar now but no less true. "I love you," James responded, as he'd done thousands of times before, as he would do thousands of times more. And in that perfect moment, with their daughter sleeping between them and night enveloping them in its gentle embrace, Emma knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her happily ever after. Not the fairy tale kind where everything was easy, but the real kind where love was consciously chosen every day, worked through challenges, celebrated in triumphs. The kind of love that transforms, that sustains, that lasts. The kind of love worth every struggle, every doubt, every moment of fear. The kind of love that she and James had built together, one choice at a time.